incidentally, Tom Davis, this article that Tom Davis brought, he brought a copy for everybody. I hope we have enough. I wrote this for the Realist. It's called Why Was Patty Hearst Kidnapped? And it was published in 1974. And this was probably the first and only article in the world linking Ronald Reagan's desire for World War III to be part of terrorism. And the SLA was set up by the Defense Department, the CIA, the LAPD, Edwin Meese, and Ronald Reagan, and the Federal Emergency Men, the service for rounding people up. It was a test case using agents of the LAPD like Donald DeFreeze, brainwashing them and setting them in safe houses. And it introduced the first SWAT team in the United States for your evening meal to see 6 people barbecued over the evening hour, dinner hour, burned alive in a house. And that man went on to become President of the United States. And I began the article comparing the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand as causing World War, and Reagan's total goal is World War. And this was written in 1974, 12 years ago. And Tom brought copies for you. If any of you don't get them, we'll get them to you somehow. I don't know how to manage that. When Jerry invited me, he wanted me to talk about the hidden government. And what I said to him is, the problem is that there is no hidden government. Everything that happens in front of us. So I'm going to just share, I pulled out about 20 articles just to read you the titles, going back to before the war, World War I, and then going right after World War II rather, to show you just up to yesterday's newspapers, the New York Times, how much of what they do is there. The people that control have no secrets. And they're so open because nobody reads it. And nobody is to blame but us. Because we have a choice. We have libraries. We can share material with each other. And it's us that has to wake up. They know what they're doing. And everything could be prosecuted in a court of law. And I was reading a book last night, and I was laughing. It isn't really funny, but I picked it up. It's called The Drug Story. It's the factual history of America's $10 million drug cartel, its methods of operation and ownership. It was published in 1949. And this went to the history of the Rockefeller family back in 1890. They made a prescription called Nogel. And they discovered oil, 1860, and old Bill Rockefeller decided he had some extra oil, so he put it into medicine jars and sold it to people who had cancer in 1850 in Cleveland. Then he sold it to people who didn't have cancer to cure them, and then he sold it for constipation and made $10 million. It's called Cold-Joel. And he used the extra oil of the parts of oil products that didn't go into motors to give to people to cure them. And he put up a sign. He wasn't a doctor. The article tells how he had no medical degree and was selling Nogel. And then combined with IG Farben, the major Bears aspirin, and all the other wonderful medical things like LSD, 34 million of them were made in Switzerland, brought home by Allen Dulles for America. And Nogel was something that the Rockefellers made a quick buck on, the tune of millions of dollars, when it was nothing but excess oil that they couldn't put into cars. There were cars with oil in those days, or engines. And they sold it to people as cures, either to cure your cancer or to give it to you. In 1944, 43, the newspapers were filled with, and the history books were filled with articles of Lucky Luciano, Murder Incorporated. Tom Dewey prosecuted him in New York. Navy intelligence took him out of prison and put him in Europe. And they started with Meyer Lansky, the narcotic network under Navy intelligence. Read any book in libraries or go to Tom's place and get books on Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. And the drugging of America became their profit, like Rockefellers became Nogel. And the history of organized crime and Santos Traficante is still alive, works with that Colombia cocaine king, Mr. Leather and Escobar and O.J. Osha, staunch Nazis from Colombia, and narcotics went hand in glove with fascism because in communist countries they're no longer zonked out on drugs. You need free enterprise to drug people, to kill them by drugs or make dependencies. There's no more opium or heroin in China that the British gave so long, but it's in us now, and we become the third world and the conquered country. So the story of Lucky Luciano is nothing new. And Tom Dewey ran for when he ran for president, Earl Warren ran as his vice president who headed the Warren Commission. And they all stayed together through the years, thick and thin, lying and covering up, and it's in the history books. One of my favorite books is called The Nazis Go Underground by Kurt Reese. I'll just read you 3 sentences or so. The Nazis went underground on May 16, 1943. They had meetings to decide their organizations. They would use symphonies, newspapers, athletics. On the morning of November 9th, 1942, an important conference was held with Heinrich Himmler and Martin Bormann, who in 1941 set up the condition in case Hitler lost that war, they'd be together afterwards. And by May 43, the Gestapo and Himmler had organizations which had entire preparatory work for the Nazi underground after the war. Project Paperclip tells when 600 Nazi scientists came to the United States. At the time they proposed this, they wanted the supremacy of the United States and the world in rocket developments. They would construct an outer station useful for astronomers and for the launching of spaceships. They would construct a large reflector for focusing the sun rays on the earth for power-generating purposes that could be used for another objective. A terrible thing, a weapon that will enable the first country to achieve this undertaking to rule the world. The focusing of this reflector upon any single living person would kill them immediately. Oceans could be kindled to steam, forests instantly kindled. This impressed the Americans so much, impressed by the Germans' advanced thinking, and receptive to their expressed desire to continue work in the United States, they urged a recommendation that they be taken immediately to Aberdeen Proving Ground and to America, and some of them then went on to Stanford and all the major universities, and down at Punaman where the space rockets are, and that's why Mr. Gorbachev says the bottom line is no Star Wars, and Reagan knows we can control the world if we control the weapons. And as governor of California in 1966, his first trip was to Lawrence Livermore to connect with Edward Teller. And he's been planning this before he was governor, but that was his first step. And he will never settle for anything less than that. Martin Bormann, Nazi in exile. It tells about, quoting Winston Churchill, telling his cabinet, in wartime, truth is so precious, she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. And since that time, the Americans and the Germans and the Japanese have decided they're against war with Russia, so that anything they do, they can lie under oath. This came out at the time of Watergate. Richard Helms said he would do it. Alan Dulles said he would do it. And they do it. And this book tells that Martin Bormann was seen the night of May 1st, 1945, and he vanished. The CIA forced Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, who made our National Security Council and CIA, to say that Martin Bormann was dead. The CIA obliged him to include statements of Bormann's death, that he died in Russia in 1969, and reminded Gehlen that he was indebted to the CIA. The CIA was behind Gehlen's statement. It was a manipulation of public opinion by the CIA. And Bormann went to South America. And Reinhard Gehlen set up all our organizations identical to Hitler's organizations when Hitler came into power, and then he was sent to Germany to head German intelligence. This article goes out in 1972. The 85-year-old Bishop of Munich, Johannes Neuhauser, made public a document of the Roman Catholic Church that said Bormann escaped to Spain. He met Albert Bormann, his brother, who waited for him. He flew in from Munich. They fled from the Salzburg airport. The airport had not been destroyed. There were at least 10 flights from there, and the Fuhrer's messengers went with official documents. All aircraft were suitable for night and long-distance flights. Hanna Rausch, Hitler's favorite pilot, and Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the head of the Luftwaffe, flew from Germany to Argentina regularly for 2 years with documents and papers before the war was over. That's Martin Bormann, Nazi in General, and I could go on. No, this is the book, Martin Bormann, yeah, The Nazi in Exile. I was saying the Reinhard Heine. At a hotel in Germany, the Hotel Maison Rouge, there was a meeting August the 10th, 1944. Bormann didn't attend, but he arranged the meeting. The pads and pencils of each man were checked. The Waffen-SS technicians swept the entire room, inspecting for hidden microphones and miniature transmitters. As an additional precaution, all suites above the floor and below the floor were out of bounds for the day. The conference was attended by the Waffen-SS, 13 of them. A transcript of these meetings is available. Paul Manning was a writer for the Wall Street Journal. He went to Germany and got access to the minutes of these meetings that they had later. It said who was present, what they said, and the Third Reich was projected into a post-war profit-seeking track. President was Dr. Casper of the Cruz, the weapons manufacturer, Dr. Toll, representing Rauschlich, Dr. Sinzer, representing Messerschmitt, Dr. Kopp, Beer and Bierwanger, representing Rheinmetall, Captain Haberkorn and Roux, representing Bussing, Mr. Cardos from Volkswagen Works, Dr. Meyer, an official of the German Naval Ministry from Paris, and Dr. Strausser, Minister of the Armament of Paris. The ground must be laid for the financial level of borrowing considerable sums from foreign countries after the war. An example of this support has been useful to Germans in the past. Patents for stainless steel belong to the Chemical Foundation in New York and the Krupp Company of Germany, in the United States Steel Corporation with Carnegie, Illinois, American Steel and Wire, too, and an obligation to work with the Krupp concern. They cited the Zeiss Company, the Leica Company, the Hamburg American Line, and it goes on and on. And in the afternoon, they had a smaller conference where all the minutes later were given to Bormann, and they said, from now on, the government in Berlin will allocate large sums to industrialists, so each establishes a secure post. A war foundation in foreign countries, existing financial reserves in foreign countries were placed at the disposal of the Nazi party in order that a strong German empire be created after defeat. It is immediately required that the large factories in Germany establish small technical offices or research bureaus that are absolutely independent with no connection with the factory. This is the way Litton Industry was spinning off used aircraft. They took $34 million off the bookkeeping, started their own company. It was a splitter. These people have a cost overrun of 1 or 2 or 40 or 100 million, and they start another company. It said these bureaus will receive plans and drawings of new weapons and documents they will need to continue the research. These special offices are to be in large cities where security is better, some in small cities near hydroelectric power, where Nazi party members can be pretending to study the development of water resources for the benefit of Allied investigators. They said the technical bureaus will be held by just a few people. We will export as much of their capital as we need, meaning money, bonds, patents, out of the country. The Book of Records describes the biggest bank robbery in the world. When the Allies went into Germany, there wasn't a cent in the German banks. When we went into Japan, there wasn't a cent in the Japanese banks. They said, if you want us to fight communism, you have to support us. And they took their money. Some was Ford, some was real gold, real diamonds. They put something like 40 million in diamonds in Eva Braun's box in Switzerland. Another 10 million here, another 20 million there, and made us build the industries. And they were on the outside, ready to tap that money at any time periods to buy up major corporations. When you read that Kurt Kerkorian wanted to buy MGM, he goes to Germany and gets 50 million. When Neil Berg wants Alaska Airline and he's delivering C-130s to Libya and Gaddafi, he takes a trip to Europe, picks up 40 million. If you read the Wall Street Journal or you read news accounts of these people that come in regards to certain lawsuits, you see how they got their money. They took a trip, and DeLorean just got 20 million from Germany to start a car company. The money is there, and they get rewarded in all kinds of ways, not so grandiose sometimes, but payoff certainly. At the end of World War II, I have the New York Times here, January the 12th, 1946, and also a magazine called Science Newsletter. It goes on about the use of biological and bacterial warfare they didn't use in World War II. They said the next war will be waged with disease germs and toxins and weapons more devastating than the atomic bomb. While the atomic bomb has been a dramatic weapon in the closing phases of the recent war, other almost completely developed weapons are still more terrible. What an invasion of a country by a few thousand immunized tourists loaded with anthrax, or the toxin of botulism or typhoid or influenza, or maybe AIDS, or new bacteria, filterable bacteria, will be developed, and this is the plan without any warning. That was January the 12th, 1946, in Science magazine. Another article on biological warfare, preparations for the next war. Add germs to the atomic bombs and rockets. 4,000 scientists met with the Army and Navy in the preparation of the next war. That was going back to 1946, and we used the experiments that the Japanese used in Manchuria, and American troops rewarded the Japanese scientists, brought them to the United States for their expertise. Another article, January 13th, 1946, this is the New York Times article, bacterial warfare poses a problem as hard to solve as that of the atomic bomb. And it goes into diseases and the conference of 4,000 scientists getting ready for World War III in 1946. And nothing has stopped them since. In the book, The Last Hero, it's about Mr. Donovan of the OSS. It says, and I've had this on my radio program many times, in May 1945, as early as, and by April 47, the war was over, May 8th, 1945, 2 days later, William Stevenson of British intelligence met with American intelligence that he had been working during the war, formed a company called British American Canadian Corporation that involved the major corporations throughout the world, and it was registered in Panama. They met with people like Sir Charles Hambro, special agent from British intelligence, George Muirton from British intelligence. They put in the top corporations from all over the world, and in the last part of this book, the book's about 900 pages, page 796 and 797, it lists all the major corporations from all the various countries. It set up 750 businesses in preparation and writing that they would use bacterial, biological warfare. And this World Commerce Corporation was to be placed in 47 countries through branch offices, subsidiaries, with worldwide network. They, by the end of 1947, they had located them with these people that were going to control the various countries where they were located, and the means, I suppose, of the news media, the channels, and the methods by which to make war against Russia. By 1947, it says, as the Cold War had developed in intensity. Now, there was no Cold War in 1947. There was a war that ended in 1945, and when Russia got defensive, they said, oh, that's a Cold War, you're getting ornery. Therefore, we have to do this, and they already had their meetings 2 years earlier. They said as the Cold War developed in intensity, particularly in Germany, stockholders associations gathered together. Among the stockholders was the Atlas Corporation of New York, Bacon Whipple and Company of Chicago, David Bruce, Ellen and Henry S.G. Bruce of New York, and it lists the various cities and companies, the Mullenscapes, they're important, the Hambros Bank, there's branches in Bermuda, Sarah Mullenscape, who formed the Heritage Foundation. And this book, if you're interested, The Last Hero, it's about Wild Bill Donovan, goes into the things that he wanted to plan, turning the OSS to the CIA in preparation for World War III. In this book, it cites, page 776, the Russians are suspicious, they're mysterious that the OSS and powerful bankers of the United States will influence the U.S. policy in occupied Germany. The roster includes the Paul Mellon family, the Julius and Henry Morgan family, the House of Morgan, the DuPont family, Gordon Auchenschluss, the Warwick Potter family, Harold Coolidge, William Allen, the Astor family, and they were nervous that we were planning World War III. Another article came out right after that saying no planning for war with Russia was commenced before March of 1946. And there is a long series of literature denying that they planned it in 43, but admitting by 1946 the war with Russia was planned. Drew Pearson wrote about William Donovan. He said he's a mad fascist intelligence master who wanted to atomize Bolshevism out of existence. That was 1946, but as I had on my radio program about 3 weeks ago, Zbigniew Brzezinski says that 100 million Russians have to die, and they can't afford to live, and this is on the drawing plans of the National Security Council. So this has gone on since 1943. The great hero Charles Lindbergh wrote in his book, and this was reprinted, an excerpt of his last book. It said, famed aviator Charles Lindbergh said that by losing World War II, we won the war in a military sense, but in a broader sense, it seemed to me we lost it for Western civilization. Much of our Western culture was destroyed. We lost the genetic heredity formed through eons of many million years. When the GIs went over there, black GI married white German girls, and when the race barrier was down for a little while after the war, we lost for eons of years that genetic heritage that we were going to, as Hitler was sanitizing Europe and making a certain type of race with a certain width of fingers, a certain shape of head. It couldn't be too broad. You had to be tall. You had to have long, thin hands. And he had the perfect body, and they would put people, the Gestapo, the SS, up to those patterns to see if they measured it in order to be members of the Gestapo. Well, this is 1986, an article from Paris, William Fapp. U.S. went from hero to pariah among the nations of the third world. Another story this last week from the Wall Street Journal. New budget comes out. Favored few allies get most of the U.S. aid, as struggling democracies receive little. Who gets it? Pakistan and Israel. Those are the two that got the most money. There were many articles out for long periods of time. I have one here. This is from New Solidarity, the roots of Swiss usury and Nazism. This is 1983. 2 full newspaper-sized articles on the use of Swiss banks to refurbish Nazism again. A lot of books on the Nazi conspiracy within our government that have been available, books and articles. One on Hitler, Dulles, and the B'nai B'rith, which shocks people until you know the members of the Mossad, of the B'nai B'rith, who do in fact, and I don't mind if you argue with that, do work hand in glove with Nazis down the line, and I can cite country after country, person after person. Now last week, you probably saw the San Jose Mercury story. Air Force brainstorms about genetically altered pilots. The Air Force researchers have recommended studying genetically engineering pilots of the future or implanting computer chips in their brains to boost their performance, according to previously undisclosed reports. And it goes on how to make thought waves of computers into their heads so that they can fling meteors better and design biological diseases that could invade and eat enemy computers that they want to construct. 10 years ago, I had an article about our government making 25 million transponders. It would only cost $5. You'd pay for it. They insert it in you, and it tells you how many miles you can go geographically, 1 mile or 2 miles. If you go out of it, it beeps you, gets you back into that area, and you can't leave it. They're already using that as of this past 3 months. This is San Francisco Chronicle, February the 2nd, 1987. Electronic custody working well. It's 2 years, not a few months. 2 years of successful experience in 20 states already has increased the interest of law enforcement agencies of using electronic tracking devices to check the movements of parolees, probationers, and individuals awaiting trial for minor offenses, the Department of Justice reported. These devices vary to the degree of supervision. They've been monitored by 45 different programs by 900 individuals, and it says they're not intrusive. They do not permit eavesdropping on you. They do not record your conversation, but they tell how far you go and where you go and make sure you stay where you are. And I'm sure the person on the outside gets beat going in the door. So they already are using this for 2 years in 20 states. Another article in the Washington Times, January the 8th, this 2 weeks ago, a week ago. Federal office to get police state phones. They call it a police state. You know, 2 years before the war was over, they were planning this. Federal officials unveiled plans for a new government telephone that critics say will muzzle contacts between the press and turn against itself as an espionage tool. It is a police state security officer's dream. It's called the FTS 2000. The new phone has a capability that transforms the way federal agents do business. It said that there's a 370-page list of specifications. The system will serve 1.3 million federal employees after 1988. They're doing away with the 24-year-old phone system. By 1988, all federal employees will have a computer terminal attached to their telephones that will allow them to determine who was calling after one ring, decide if they want to answer, transfer the call, and tape record the conversation. The system will track all calls made to and from every telephone in the government. It will make it possible for officials who have access to the data to track down government leaks. They will match these telephones with government employees making or getting press conferences or calling other congressional offices to talk to them. It's a ready-made apparatus to discredit people. The government can do the same thing with some of their records now, but this new system will be much more important. It's being built by Martin Marietta Corporation and MCI Communications are bidding. It will cost the taxpayers $4.2 billion to make sure that your congressman can't tell another congressman that something is wrong, or tell the newspaper or anybody. Now, in July of last year, there was a long article in the Washington Post, Building a Force for World War IV. It's a full-page article on the necessity of having a quick shootout, of which maybe half the population in this country, 100 million and 100 million Russians or more, will be killed. But the weapons are getting ready for World War IV after that messy thing. Now that was 1986 July. Last week it was updated in the San Francisco Chronicle 3 weeks ago, February the 1st, 87. Preparing for World War IV. The Pentagon plans to survive a nuclear war and keep on fighting. They'll keep fighting. We won't have the places to go. Then this last week, Washington Post, this is January 15th, a month ago. Public kept in dark of $25 billion for defense. This is dark money, classified money, weapons you don't know about, high-tech projects, maybe transponders for everybody, maybe telephones for everybody. Every call we make, every call recorded, the Congress is asking now because the budget is coming up to give us $25 billion that we don't have to account for. With that mindset, can you imagine where this goes? And then to say that Star Wars or Project Paperclip isn't outdated, January the 18th, 1987, offensive taken for partial Star Wars deployment, and they're ready. And just in the newspapers the last few days, you may have seen the first missile, I forget the name of it, was shot up in the air that was the weapon to be used for World War IV. It was launched just last month for World War IV. It was put into place. The People's Daily World has an article by Carl Floyce. I like his articles. If you ask me, a secret foreign policy is run by a secret team. And the reason I cite him is that people think, well, the right wing does this and the left is trying to tell you something. But Carl Floyce, or anybody who thinks this has been secret, is part of the problem. Anybody who thinks this isn't public domain, I just cited maybe 10 articles or 3 books out of 3,000 books and 3 million articles that I say on leaping fascism. This New York Times this past week, Reagan's secret foreign policy apparatus. You heard about it. It's called Project Democracy. Then they called it National Endowment for Democracy. So secret, even the National Security Council doesn't know what it does. They can go with offshore banks, travel where they want, have their own airplanes, their own boats, their own agents to do the jobs they want. And then finally, there is another article I just want to cite from the New York Times this past week, North's Record, a wide role in a host of sensitive projects. And it tells about the various things that Oliver North has been involved in. But an interesting thing is that he wanted to take care of giving a lot of money down to El Salvador, and probably Roberto Dobas on that crowd, but they were killing too many people. So he wanted to tell them to stop killing so many people or they wouldn't get the money. At least on the surface, they shouldn't kill so many people. So the article says, Colonel North became one of the key advisors in the program on how to disguise the murders in El Salvador until they got the money from Congress. It was managed in Washington by James Mitchell, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Inter-American Affairs. The team agreed that as part of the government's effort, a top United States official had to visit El Salvador. The State Department proposed it, and they asked Vice President Bush, according to former members of Vice President Bush's staff, former members, no one on the staff would admit this, and Bush agreed. Before Bush embarked, Colonel North briefed him at length, at least once in the White House, and he went to San Salvador with Bush on the Air Force and briefed him again when they landed. Now, Bush was CIA director for a year and a half. Bush was ambassador to China. He was our ambassador to the United Nations. You have to say, for who does Oliver North brief George Bush? What are they doing there? Because all Ronnie has to do is call him in and say, George, tell him to cool it in El Salvador. What more do you need? And if you don't know that North represents that notorious Fritz Kramer I talked about on the air, or who's in the national security over him, or Zbigniew Brzezinski, or Alexander Haig, or Henry Kissinger, then you don't know American history. And that is the pecking order. North tells Bush what to do. And that is in our newspapers now. And the whole point of my research after I got started, when I knew he'll kill Kennedy, was to zoom into those secret pockets of secret government that even those officially recognized by the cabinet as cabinet who passed the congressional questions or appointed by the president, inside of them is this other team. And the other point I want to make is that they're not secret. They're in the news. They're there. You can see them. You just have to put on a different kind of glasses. You have to change your frames or something because they're there. I only use public material and I can zoom in on these people. And if you read your paper, the New York Times, and you see that North is briefing Bush in the White House, a lieutenant colonel from the Marines, nothing makes sense unless you know who talks to North. And that's who makes policy, not the guys put into Congress, the Senate, or the House. It's this other group that has them by the throat. Now, what I do, those of you who've been where I've spoken before at the campuses, I leave the rest of the evening open to you, because many of you have questions, and some people say I'm controversial. so I heard a rumor that I'm controversial. So we'll try to make them short. But this is your evening, and if you have things on your mind and I don't cover them, you're going to go home disappointed. So you tell me what you want to share with me and the other people, and we'll take some questions. Yeah?
Last week, before you talked about the neutron weapon,
yes.
It exploded in the Cameroon situation. Mm-hmm. Which you're sourcing that. Also want to know why you're alive, why you haven't been assassinated. I have my own answers, but why aren't you and others like the rest of us thinking people suppress, repress, and it just doesn't lull and inured into the silence of like.
Well, you're asking a lot of questions now. You're asking why people are silent and lulled and why I'm alive, and the evidence on camera. What is the same answer for all three?
All right.
Okay. Let's take Cameroon. With each broadcast, and I encourage you to do this, a lot of people do. If you don't want to write a letter a month, just send a self-addressed stamped envelope, because 22 cents will fill 4 bibliography sheets. There's people that subscribe to my broadcast that go out every week, the tape center. And with those tapes is a source of information on where I get my material. And when I talk about Cameroon, the suggestion of the neutron bomb came from somebody who lived there. And I realized that all the scientists that went there couldn't agree at all. In fact, they had a convention in Hawaii, and 1,000 of them last week, and still couldn't figure out what happened. And that Shimon Peres was going to visit the president of Cameroon, and Israel hadn't been recognized by Cameroon for 12 years, and he conveniently flies in with 17 doctors and sends them to the area. And John Singlaub was fired by Jimmy Carter, resigned because he wanted to deploy the neutron bomb. We can't deploy it if you don't have it. And Alexander Eglen Danilov was arrested in the Soviet Union. The question came up, do we have news people in the CIA? And William Casey says, well, sometimes we do, like when Alexander Haig was in Europe in 1982 trying to encourage them to place a neutron bomb in Europe. We used the CIA press to stop the riots in Europe and tell them there was nothing to fear from the neutron bomb. So we had Shimon Peres, who's very much in this Contragate story, if you've been reading. We have John Singlaub, who was the kingpin of the Iran-Contragate, the Knights of Malta, the World Anti-Communist League, the Western Goals. He's the hub of all these things. We have Alexander Haig and William Casey, the same cast of characters that identified with that event. Now, I'm not a scientist, but when a scientist comes to Paris and one comes from the United States and they say, well, this is this kind of gas, but then gas doesn't burn. And then one says, well, those people must have burned because they were too close to their stove that night. You know, this is what West Orleans and that little girl right down the road had the napalm. He said she was cooking on a hibachi. And you know, these are, I've got a Wall Street Journal, New York Times. I have no secret sources. San Francisco Examiner, LA Herald, you know, Houston Post. And people are just cooking too much. You gotta get out of the kitchen. You know? And I know that they want these weapons to eliminate all of Black Africa because there's a lot of minerals and jewels and resources that we think we need and can use better than they can use, and we won't let them develop it. And being as we've decimated Black Africa in every way we could, and don't care about them, and Shimon Peres has assisted the military junta in Nigeria. He's assisted in, Israel has assisted with Cameroon since the dictator came in 2 years ago financially with oil agreements and so forth. And, then the other part was that after I started the broadcast on Cameroon with the suspicion of these people, Mordecai Vanunu, who left Israel and moved to Australia, went to London to tell them the capability of Israel with the atomic plants and the neutron bomb. And I get the London Times every Sunday, and in the center of the paper is the neutron bomb. And that paper came out on a Sunday. He was kidnapped on Friday by the Mossad, and nobody has been able to see him or talk to him since. Only in Rome, when he was taken to Israel, he wrote on his hands with some charcoal at the window of the car how he was kidnapped, on which plane, and the Italian government asked about his being kidnapped. And there are a lot of articles out of the Soviet Union asking about Mordecai Vanunu, because this is a very important weapon, but it's all to sleep. And being as they planned it since 1946 and they haven't, why wouldn't they test it there? So if you send a letter asking for the sheets that accompany the neutron Cameroon articles, I'll send them to you. And the second part, how come I'm alive? Well, I'm not sure I am. That's the answer. And you're not sure who I am either, so you don't know if it's me. And that's that question. I just don't know how much you know. You never saw me before, so you don't know who I am. See? So I don't know. I mean, and how come people aren't more aware? Well, if you have 10 hours, I'll tell you. But I think, first of all, some people don't have any IQ, and those that have it get killed in school. You know, there's your religious leader, your priest, your rabbi, there's your teacher, and your parent. In between the three of them, they brainwash you until they pay for a high college education, without which you can't figure much, and then they don't want you asking nosy questions because you wouldn't be grateful. The Senator Joe McCarthy, the blacklisting, the Cold War, the man whose secretary was working is the secretary for Western Goals where John Singlaub is today. Louise Reese, who married what's the name of Jerry? Okay, you know, the rat Reese, I call him. But Louise Reese worked for Senator Joe McCarthy. And you read the books of World War II, McCarthy released the defendants at Dachau that killed the Americans among Fritz Fraser. The ones he released were released, none of them hung, none of them served time except 3 months. They were out in 1948. They were out the same time that the other Kramer started working at the Pentagon, 1948. So I began collecting books on German history to see how Hitler's Kramer became a general. And there isn't, except for one book that is so wishy-washy and skirts around the background and everything about him, there isn't a single book about the other Fritz Kramer during any battles in which he was so poor to Hitler or became a general or had anything to do with war with Hitler. And after the war, all the others have a history. You get the history books of the Bulge and you read them, and they all have history. There's not a record of Fritz Kramer. And the official American history book for each battle is a series, and I have the one on the Ardennes Offensive. It's 700 pages, and the only thing it said was Fritz Kramer was over Sepp Dietrich. It doesn't say why he was a defendant, why he went to jail, what he did. I wrote to Israel, to the library there where they keep a record of war criminals. I said, do you have a history of where Nazi General Fritz Kramer went? They said, we never heard of him. I sent a picture. He's sitting in a docket. He's a criminal. They said, we never heard of him. Germany never heard of him. And I believe that Hitler's general, because all the others went to work for us, the top ones, I believe he was with us because the army papers I got at the end of the war, he was in Ireland, Scotland, Germany. He was in 4 different countries the last 4 months of the war. And I think he happened to be on the German side in a German uniform and was picked up with the others. So had to go to trial and was assured he'd get off. And I believe that Hitler's top general has run the Pentagon since 1948. And I have written, the General Accounting Office had 2 men at my house for 8 hours and went over all the information because Peter Rodino was supposed to see about deporting people who came here to war criminals and got under false subterfuge. And you have a picture of them in the docket. Prisoner 33. They spent 8 hours with me, wrote me a letter. It was so nice to see you. You live in a wonderful city. Carmel was so nice. And it was so nice to spend the day with you, and we appreciate your time. They came all the way to California and didn't even mention Fritz Kramer's name in the letter. We came because we thought you thought there was somebody in this country who was a prisoner, so we spent the day with you. Anyone going through the archives, the history of the General Accounting Office, the history of Nazis, won't find in their letter the name Fritz Kramer. And this would account for the death squads, the murders, the continuous escalation of the Star Wars to control the world, the flight capital, take the money out of our banks, pollution of our waters, poisoning our foods, destructing, taking the steel out of the country, the factories out of the country, bringing the Japanese in to start making our cars, combining the major corporations' buyouts of people that you work their hard way to get it together and now buying them out or merging them. And everything that is happening to us now, we are the third world. Whatever Britain, America, or France or Spain did to other countries is happening to us now. People on the streets are meant to be there. AIDS is meant to be there. Mental sickness is meant to be there. Reagan wanted them on the street. He literally closed the mental hospitals. They don't want cures for things. If you have a sickness, they'll charge you. What is the new catastrophic? $200,000 to $1 million. The medical bills, the doctors don't want to handle it. Flight capital, the banks are empty. The money's offshore banks. And what is happening to us is a classical case of totally destroying us. And the same people have been at the top doing it since World War II. And have made provisions to live through World War III and take on after World War IV. They're asking, the reason World War IV is coming out now is they're asking Congress to give them the budget for War IV. If that isn't total insanity, everything is out of control. It's gone the limit. It can't be any worse. Your transponders, your phones, and I brought just a few articles. I didn't want to do too much. So my concern has been, now Leon Bennett will be here next week. He helped me with that. Asked him if any of you go to those meetings talking about Contragate. Henry Kissinger was in charge of Central America. Asked him, when I go to see him, I said, Contragate is such a big story. There's so many tentacles. Come to my house and let me show you some of the areas so when these things come out, you'll know what there is there. He's a Democrat, and the other administration has gotten us in this problem And he lives just a few miles from where I am and has to pass the house to go back 1 mile up a hill. He has no intention to ever come and look at any of that material. He can be everywhere else but there. When you go to think about Big Mountain and you read about Richard Nixon, and maybe they won't mention Nixon, they'll talk about the plight of the Indians, the radiation, the uranium, the taking out of the minerals. That was decided in 1972 when Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, when Richard Nixon was president, that these Indians would move at this time. And if you have meetings about Indians and you don't mention Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon and Paul Laxalt to put those things together, you only talk about the problems. You can talk all day about cancer. It doesn't matter. You got to get at the people doing it. If you don't name names, you can't solve the problem. You can sit and talk about the tragedies, and you can sell a lot of Kleenex, and you can feel you did a good job, but you're not even scratching the surface. Whenever you have these meetings, if the people that talk to you don't use names, you've got to ask them. Bea Clarksville was in San Francisco. I'd written to her about Fritz Kramer. I asked her about it. Someone went to the meeting. They said, do you know Mae Brussell? No. Do you know Fritz Kramer? She says he was important. You know, in Germany, Hitler's general, she said he's not important anymore. She doesn't know where he is. How does she know he's not important? He's more important than Claus Barbie for today's world. John Stockwell came down to Monterey Institute to speak. And I asked him afterwards, I said, you talk about Central America, Nicaragua. Do you know Fritz Kramer? Henry Kissinger made the policy and Kramer's his mentor. He said, Kramer isn't important anymore. 3 weeks later, a guy who says, I was station chief in Angola, I'm a good guy now, I'm with you, I don't like the CIA, but Kramer isn't important. And 3 weeks later, a staunch conservative like Robert Novak tells you where he's sitting, making every major decision. How can a Stockwell say he isn't important? You're watching and hearing people. That isn't a good enough answer if you want answers. You can't settle for that, or you can meet every night of the week and cry a different part of the world. It keeps people busy, but the bleeding is going to go on till we get these people out. Bring Fritz Kramer out, fingerprint him, let him go to Congress. This is what I want. You say, Fritz, we got your war record at Dachau. Just put your little thumb down and let's see what we got to see. That's what I want to do. And I want it. No top secrets, boy. We want to see it. Right there. You look at it and don't let Mr. Gates tell us what it is either. We want to see your little fingerprint. Because we got the other one. And if you were military intelligence, we know. We know the German one. Now, for once and for all, show us that Hitler isn't running this country. That's what I want to know, And I've saved hundreds of books that make me believe more and more every day that it is him. Pictures and other ways. I sent a picture to him in Washington of Kramer in the dock at 40 years younger, and Kramer at the Pentagon, like 35 years older. And it doesn't prove it's him, but it's a close enough resemblance. And I sent the two, and I said, is this you? Well, he didn't answer, and it didn't come back. So I wrote to Nick Beamish of the Washington Post, who wrote the only article that ever came out on Fritz Kramer in 1975. And I said, is there any possibility that the Kramer you wrote, the whole article is about subterfuge, secrecy. Get it from your library, magazine section of the Washington Post. It is March 75. He wrote back in big letters, how dare you ask such a question? No wonder he doesn't answer you. And then the next week I read that he's on the board of Heritage Foundation, and 2 months later he was dead. That was the great Nick Beamish from the Washington Post. The death was coincidental, but how do you dare ask that? Maybe he asked it and then was dead. Maybe a seed was planted or he knew. But that's a long answer, but it's really pertinent. It's the seed of what I caught into, and I've been pursuing it ever since. Yeah.
You brought this up, and I've heard it from other sources, that 1989, if they can say, get a Republican in there, that there will be a big push for an open and complete Nazi takeover of the United States. Do you still see this Is them trying a big push for this and that?
Well, I don't think, people think that an open big takeover is walking around with boots and armbands with flags, speaking German. It isn't going to happen that way. You know, it's more like America where we've been taken over by the Germans. I didn't see the movie and I won't watch it. But we've been taken for all purposes because every time there's a crisis, we were talking about that at dinner tonight, every time there's a crisis, there's a condition that Henry Kissinger have access to the media first. He's on the board of ABC, NBC, CNN, Public Broadcasting, Channel 9, CBS. Mr. Kissinger is the expert with Alexander Haig and Zbigniew Brzezinski and Richard Allen. Another one, Richard Allen was stationed in Germany. He brought home the money from Germany to start this Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's in the news now. They bought the ones who trained Gene Kirkpatrick, Henry Kissinger, all the far-right speakers, think tanks, with the Mellonscape money behind it. It came from Germany. It tells the National Security Council what to tell the president. And the only way we're going to crack this thing is to get them off the television. They come on as experts and they ruin every country they've touched. They leave it. They set up the Middle East and they leave them fighting each other. They go to Southeast Asia, they leave Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam in shambles. They put in Pinochet in Chile, and the people just are gunned down, stomped on, don't have a chance. But in Zia in Pakistan, he increases his arms with airplane and narcotic traffic and planes to fly over Russia and keep the drugs, more drugs coming in from there, second to Colombia. But that's a lot. We have completely destroyed these countries, and where these men failed everywhere else, we bring them back for the next crisis. Reagan says, Kissinger, take Central America. And he has a committee in Central America with Oliver North on it helping him. Take Central America. Before it was Southeast Asia, then the Middle East, South Africa. They give them sections of the world. 2 weeks ago out on the air, they said our next trouble spot is the South Pacific. That basin, all those poor islands there, They've already identified 5 articles saying this is our next trouble spot. They want to take the troops out of NATO and put them in the Pacific basin. Those poor natives don't have a chance. You'll have committee meetings and sign-in sheets with the natives of Palau. You're going to go on and on. Helping these native populations. And those same people are brought on as experts, and nobody says, by what expertise do we see them day after day? Every talk show, Face the Nation, Meet the Press, Crossfire, Nightline. Their same ugly faces. Aren't you saturated with them? They all come out of the same fabric. And they have a little door they call the White House basement. That's because the limousine pulls up there. Little dark windows, and they go up to where they go. But the elevator, they may work in the basement, but the elevator takes them right up to the Oval Office. They like you to think it's a little rat hole down there. It's called the White House, where the president sits. That's where they work. Okay, more questions. Yeah.
What the connection is between Cruz being running the Pentagon since 1948 and the inner destruction of the United States and steel going out of Japan? Why would this conspiracy of Nazi people be destroying the United States?
Because why did Hitler say, I want to conquer the world, and the world includes the United States, but we don't have to take the United States, we take South America, and then we manage the collapse of the United States. See, the United States can only develop we can only equal Germany and Japan if we educate our people, if we house our people, if we medicate our people, if we control their savings, provide recreation, advanced university. When you take those things away, you lose everything.
Right.
You lose everything we've got. And you poison their water, poison their food, radiate the food. How many countries are eating radiated food? Why did Advanced Genetic Sciences, a corporation formed with Roman Haas and IG Farm and Dow Chemical, why did they come from Belgium and Sweden with live bacteria to put in Monterey County or Santa Cruz County? What are they doing here that they can't do there? If they want frost banned, they have enough frost in Sweden. They ought to keep it there. They shouldn't be allowed to bring it here. There's frost in Belgium, I've been told. What's it doing here? Nobody here wants strawberries in December or January. Won't we settle for February or March? Can we wait? I mean, what's so important? To bring live genetically altered food to see how far it travels in the air? Who needs it? You know, the winter months, you eat oranges, pineapple, bananas, seasons, grapefruits, things in season. What's our hurry? That they want to save us from ice on our strawberry plants and come from Belgium. Mr. Bocard of AGS flies back and forth to Belgium every 2 weeks. What are they doing in our state or anywhere? They don't belong at all. And it can be very harmful to us. And once it's out, it can't be stopped. To destroy America. Well, go to the library. How many books have you read about Nazi Germany in the period of 1938 to 1949? How many books have you read? Well, I have a wall full of books on how they want to take America. Infiltrate it, take it over. Why do we want Russia? For the same reason. That big hunk of land, why do we want Russia? Why have we been so obsessed with Russia? Britain lined up with Japan in 1905 and bombed the fleet of Russia, trying to start a war, stop Russian fleets in 1905. Why? Isn't that ridiculous? That Sidney Riley, the spy, and the British, they didn't want Russian ships in the Pacific because they'd have to share the gems out of India, maybe the sapphires, maybe the vegetation, maybe the narcotics traffic, maybe the oil, the Baku oil fields. What did they want Russia? Because people want other people's property. Why did they leave Spain and come to America? Why did they conquer America, South America? That's a different problem. Why? Why does Napoleon leave France? He could have stayed in France and been happy. I mean, or Alexander the Great. Why do they leave home? What do they need? Because you destroy the people. We have resources. We have forests, we have minerals, we have oil, and they don't like us. We didn't allow them, we didn't join them to fight Russia, for one thing. We put Hitler in power, we, the American corporations and banks and British, put him in power, guaranteeing the support to fight Russia. And then when he turned around and started bombing England, we had to fight him, and they didn't like that. They didn't like losing World War II or World War I. And they said that in 1943. So they don't like us, that we didn't help them push on to Russia and take it, so they don't like us. Yeah?
Yeah, and just, if you're a third world person, and you look at policy in the United States and over the globe, it's the white people that have the choices for VCRs, cassettes, child care, how many cars you're going to have. If you look at the status quo in the world, you're able to see it. You're questioning it. You don't see it. They're third world people, myself included, who can identify it just because of the status quo. So I'd like to talk about our next president, Hart.
No, I don't like to talk 2 years ahead. Hart's very close, thanks, to Henry Kissinger and the Colorado crowd is the big new Brzezinski and Daniel Graham of Star Wars. He is their baby. And you'll get that choice or nothing, and you'll get Jesse Jackson to split the vote. And they can put in anyone they want, like Buchanan or Kemp or anybody, because the Democrats aren't smart enough to study the candidates before the election, or they allow themselves to be split. And if they don't get their act together, then they get what they deserve. Wait, listen, yeah.
Have you heard anything on the, you had something a couple weeks ago on the government running drugs?
Oh, I've been doing that every week. Did you hear last week?
I mean, Monday this past?
Yeah.
No, I was away.
Okay, no excuses. Let's kick him out of the room. I'll give you one more chance on Wednesday on KKUP from 5 to 6. Do you work from 5 to 6?
That's today.
No.
That's today.
Huh?
No,
That's today.
I'll catch it.
No, but next Wednesday they get last week's tape.
Oh, but the
See, what I on the air Monday, you'll get next Wednesday.
one about drugs was today, though.
Well, last week I did drugs. Last night I did the connections of George Bush. There's a very important article, two very important cases in the news last week. One is a trial. Oh, this is so funny. You know, a few people in Washington want to get drugs. Nancy wants to stop the drugs, you know? And the FBI wants to help Nancy, tell them say no. So somebody gets off the FBI that there's cocaine dealing in Washington. Oh, so they put the tax on these people 7 months ago, before Hassenfuss, before Congregate. They thought they had a cocaine market, and they tapped some people with pizza parlors. And they caught the connection of the pizza family, the pizza parlors, down to the cocaine cartel of Mr. Letter and Mr. Escobar and Jorge Oche's defendant, his pal, and they tapped the New York pizza parlors, and they began a case that they thought was really very interesting. But by the time they brought it to court, the pizza parlors connect to Merrill Lynch and Don Reagan of the White House Chief of Staff, and connect to the defendants of the Christic Institute, the Medellin drug dealers that send the drugs to the Contras. So the suit that just started in Washington, D.C., was in the Washington Post February the 3rd. And that's why Mr. Letter Rivas was picked up on the 4th in Columbia. They've known about him for 20 years. He's a partner of Vesco. So they brought him in, and simultaneously, see, this suit is against the drug dealers, and the drugs that they were tapping into use the Southern Air Transport and the same CIA airplane that Hassenfuss has. So they were only catching drug dealers in Washington, and they caught the connections to the New York pizza parlor, which is Donald Reagan's operation, to Italy, to Sicily, Italy, which is the Steve-bound Vatican Banco Ambrosiano, down to the Colombia cocaine cartel. And these guys, 12 of them are going on trial. 2 of them are defendants in the Christic Institute trial and linked to the CIA. So that court case is taking place in Washington, but if you don't take the Washington Post and don't listen to World Watchers, you wouldn't know. The second case began this past week where a man named Mr. Pierce, P-E-A-R-C-E, sued E.F. Hutton because the president of E.F. Hutton, who was Mr. Pierce, P-I-E-R-C-E, Scott Pierce, is the brother-in-law of George Bush. And they made the lesser agencies fall guys for drug dealing and check hiding, sending $1 billion, $2 billion out of the country. And Pierce is suing E.F. Hutton, and that court begins March the 1st, and he's suing E.F. Hutton, and the attorney who got $2.5 million for E.F. Hutton is none other than Griffin Bell, who went to rescue Hassenfuss the day he fell. So I don't know, if you don't listen every week, or for the past years, you can't appreciate the depth of this. But if you live in Washington, they must have diarrhea. I mean, this is so exciting. You know, it doesn't take a lot of people to know. They announced today on the news that Nancy won't talk to the chief of staff. All she had to do was read the Washington Post last week. You know, and about Griffin Bell with Hassenfuss and Bush's brother-in-law, that he's tied, they're E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch were the conduits for the Sicilian pizza money to go to the banks through New York City from the Waldorf Hotel, and that was written up by Reagan's Crime Commission, Judge Kaufman. So now they all tie into Congregate. But what I did this week, Monday, the Tape Center sends them out during the week. So if you listen to World Watchers next Wednesday, you can get caught up. If you listen Wednesday, you'll get the program I did the week before. And it's very exciting. Yeah.
You did a briefly on some of the events that you passed in Code Law 93531 back in 74 there. You did that earlier. I'd like to hear
Yeah. What part, say it louder and say what you want to know about the bill.
the connections of Kissinger, you're talking Kissinger, Nixon, the divvying up 2 years before it actually happened, passage of the bill.
I don't even remember which bill you're talking about.
Navajo relocation.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, there was a bill that was signed when Nixon was president, working with Henry Kissinger, that it was signed in 1972. It has a name. I have it at home if you want to send it again. Self-addressed envelopes, but don't just send the envelope, say what you want. And they decided in 1972 that by 1986 the Navajos would be out. So that this didn't just happen to say, hey, your lease is up, go. You know, it doesn't work that way. They plan 8, 10 years ahead, 12 years ahead, and have all the provisions for what they will do or won't do with these people. And so the laws are made there a long time ago. You know, just like in the book The Higher Form of Killing, it describes in 1972 when Richard Nixon was president and Henry Kissinger was his chief advisor, he decided we won't have this bacteriological warfare experiments or stockpiling at Fort Detrick, Maryland. So they ordered them to be dispersed to hospitals, overseas, to universities, to be kept in a safe place. They said they weren't at Fort Detrick, but they didn't tell you where else they were. I had to go through 3 government documents to find out where they went. So they turned the lab over to Linton Industry, which was in the New York Times and not in the history books. They turned it over to Linton Industry to create and work on a disease that would break down if the immune system couldn't hold itself up again. And they said it would take 7 or 8 years to do it, and by 1981 they had AIDS. And it came out of the same laboratory, and they tell you that Kissinger and Nixon stopped the germ warfare, therefore we have to escalate it. They kept the diseases safe, and they're now moving them to Indiana and to Utah. You know, it's funny, the Mormons don't drink and they don't smoke, but they love housing bacteriological warfare. And the leaks, I can't figure out why they want it. They get dead sheep, they have more cancer. They feel so safe having it in their backyard. If I didn't drink and didn't smoke, I wouldn't want that in my yard. There's a certain stupidity here. You'd think they'd send it to Idaho or somewhere. Why do they want it all? You know, it's really crazy how this thinking, yeah. Oh, let me get someone else. Yeah.
Could you talk about the CIA role in the events leading up to the Grenada?
The CIA in Grenada? Well, it's a very dangerous country, Grenada. You know, America's under terrible threat. I don't even want to talk about it. It was Reagan's finest hour, he said. You know, he said that. You know, and he didn't want that great big landing strip that would take over America. It was built by the Cubans under contract in London. You know, and he was such a terrible threat. Any third world country that wants to medicate itself, educate itself, treat itself in a civilized manner is not allowed to exist in this society. That was decided in 1943, 44, 45, and it has been in action. That's why I just read this article in the paper this past week from the Houston Post, that America wants the hope of the third world is the pariah. And Reagan needed some victories. He had a bunch of people who couldn't win Vietnam, and he guaranteed them they'd win something. They should have scratched the lottery, and they'd have better luck. So he plans this great invasion. Ollie North planned with Poindexter. And, you know, Frank Churchill was on the island 2 weeks before, canvassing it. North was down there. And they sent in these special forces, but Grenada did more than the killing of Maurice Bishop. Maurice Bishop had gone to Washington to William Clark, the National Security Advisor, who couldn't even spell Grenada and didn't know what it was, and he asked him for help. All these third world people come and say, you have so much, we want to be a democracy like you. Clark said no. So you either go to America or Russia. If you go to Guatemala, then they don't get foreign aid from America. If they go to another country that gets foreign aid, if they ask Pakistan help us, then Zia doesn't get money from America. Nobody gets money from America who helps somebody we don't want to exist. That's called foreign aid. So he goes there in March, and he comes down like his head between his legs, and he decides to go to Russia and ask them for help. Well, that's really dangerous. That's just terrible. So he wants two things: to show the Vietnam boys that we can win a war, and the other thing he wants to do, he wants to see that the press can be kept from invasions from that time on, knocking out a little peanut, and he wants to test computers on the island that connect to what Ollie North was building, and this has been in the papers these past weeks, these massive computers with John Singlau from Western Goals, to see if they can screen everyone on the island of Grenada. The minute the invasion was over, I read that a nurse was asked, everyone on the island had to go through a screen. They said, did you ever oppose the war in Vietnam? She said, probably yes. And she said, no. They put it into the computer. Her name showed she did. They said, you have 48 hours to go back to Detroit. She opposed the war in Vietnam, the napalm, the Agent Orange, the defoliation, the Phoenix program, the killing of maybe 2 million people, and she could no longer be on Grenada. They wanted to show the computer works. And they wanted to show Admiral Poindexter, who was first in his class at Annapolis, and Ollie North, that you can have war without anybody covering it for 3 days. And once that is set, they said, the world press, you may come with us, only if you pass this test. So they tested them last week in Honduras and flew down about 1,100 people and some news people that didn't tell us in advance because they took the oath that they wouldn't be there. Bunch of whores. I think he's whoring a bad name, actually. I mean, it's indescribable that these things crawl and act this way. So now 14 people are going to hang. Maurice Bishop is dead. They had no trial. They came in and circled a mental hospital. I did an article about that, but it was supposed to be in Rebel, and Rebel folded. It wasn't published. About bombing a mental hospital and telling the wards to get out of there, that they should clear out. They dropped the bombs on the mental hospital, killed about 125 people, cremated some the same day, took some out to another hospital, put a mass grave. Then the American Army dug them up and put them in the ocean. And I believe they were victims of medical experimentation like Jonestown or Wyatt. That's why I don't think the press was there, because they would see those people. And the medical school on the island is run by Jeffrey Byrne, whose son, Peter Byrne, was head of Agent Orange in chemical biological warfare, whose father, Jeffrey Byrne, came from the group in Alabama, in Georgia, that were doing experimentations on monkeys, medical experimentations there. And people from Chile said that persons had been killed in Chile and sent to Grenada for cutting up or biopsy or for research. So they had their special troops, not the regular army, the special forces, like Hitler's Freikorps. They had no press. And the two people allowed to go through Maurice Bishop's papers were Michael Ledeen of Congregate and Robert Brown of Soldier of Fortune, whose magazine was funded and started by John Singlau. And I think the C-130s could fly in warehouses of weapons. Did you see how nice they were stacked in Grenada? Did you remember those weapons? Oh, they were so neat. It was like a display show, a hobby show. Like these little, bricks that you do. Did the weapons really come that way, or were our planes kept off to bring in weapons? Did you read when Hassan-Quist's plane went down in Nicaragua, where the weapons came from that he was delivering? Do you remember the country? Russia. They buy Russian weapons. So if anybody's killed, they say, oh, we went in there and the Russians had been there. Hassan-Quist's plane had Russian weapons. And the same people involved in this were the same people in Grenada. And they should be taken out like Mussolini and hung by their heels and die.